From January 29th to April 5th, early this morning, precisely at the hour that had been appointed, the governor's aide-de-camp drove up to the door of our prison in a carriage and four. We set out, and in less than 3/4 of an hour, we reached Newlands, the governor's country house, which might be accounted a pleasant residence even in Europe. I could easily perceive that several years had elapsed since the place had first received its name, for it was surrounded by lofty trees and thick groves. Many of the fruit trees were in full bearing. One of the governor's aides-de-camp placed us in possession with all due form and with the most studied politeness. He conducted me over the grounds and pointed out to me everything worthy of notice without mentioning a word about limits or restrictions. He took an opportunity of adroitly hinting to me that the soldiers whom I saw posted about were merely the governor's ordinary guards and had received none but their usual orders. He added that I might consider myself at home, as everything would be done under my own direction. He then took his leave. When left to ourselves in this delightful place, we felt that we had been suddenly removed from a prison to a paradise. The elegantly furnished apartments, the dovecots, and the vicinity of the houses of birds of every kind that inhabited the grounds, and numerous flower beds, groves, and delightful walks, and the silence and solitude that prevailed, all presented a somewhat magical effect, and reminded us of Zemir and Izor. We had the use of the whole house, in which all the furniture remained just as it had been left by the governor's family, not an article having been removed. My son, on opening a color box, found an unfinished drawing by one of the daughters of Lord Charles Somerset. It was a portrait of the revered object whose fate we deplore, for where is his image not to be found? Beside the drawing lay the copy from which it had been taken. It was a wretched sketch, a sort of caricature likeness to the emperor, which had been made on board the Northumberland. This thing seemed to haunt us wherever we went, and we always destroyed it with the ardent zeal of missionaries, breaking the image of false gods. In the impulse of the moment, my son made his poetical debut by writing the following lines beneath Miss Somerset's unfinished drawing. Soit vous doit élégant, tu devrais surveiller cette aubace, surtout à peindre le courage des heureux mœurs de l'avenir. Comment avez-vous déféré l'image? You have elegant fingers. It takes courage to paint. But of this hero, why are you disfiguring his image? I placed beside the drawing a small medal which afforded a more faithful representation of Napoleon. We then shut up the box, pleased with our trick and enjoying in anticipation Miss Somerset's surprise which she should one day read, and we hoped without anger the censure which we had presumed to pronounce upon her drawing. The governor had carried his attention so far as to send from town a person to act as a steward at Newlands to receive from me daily orders for provisions, and I was given to understand that I might be supplied profusely with whatever I wished for. But I had adopted Spartan manners, and I desired to be supplied merely with necessaries. As to the steward, I changed his occupation and made him my reader, in which capacity I found him a most valuable acquisition. By chance, this person proved to be a relative of the only inhabitant of St. Helena, with whom I had formed acquaintance. He was a nephew of the worthy Amphitryon, our good host of the Briars, for whom I entertained a sincere regard. The aide-de-camp visited us regularly, having received special instructions to see that we wanted for nothing. I begged that he would present my thanks and acknowledgments to Lord Charles Somerset for the delicate way in which he sought to disguise our captivity. But it was all one. I informed him, since in spite of ourselves we must deplore our absence from St. Helena and Europe. Our departure from prison and removal to Newlands produced quite a revolution in our condition. We received visits from many individuals who expressed themselves anxious to see us. General Hall, who acted as the governor's deputy during his absence, came accompanied by his wife, a lady of very pleasing person and manners, and who moreover spoke French exceedingly well. Her husband had been 11 years a prisoner in France. Mrs. Hall had proceeded thither to join him, in spite of the great restrictions which then existed between the two countries, and, if I recollect rightly, she ventured across the Channel in an open boat. Both General and Mrs. Hall were intimate with many of my friends in Paris. General Hall, who is a frank and honorable man, observed that he should feel happy in repaying me, without regard to difference of opinion, for all the good treatment he had generously experienced in France, and he kept his word. I was also visited by Colonel Weir, whose wife has a sister married to one of the members of the present English ministry. Colonel Weir resided at a short distance from Newlands, and he came, he said, to offer me his services, and as a good neighbor. And indeed, I found him an extremely agreeable one, from his kind and unremitting attentions to me. Finally, a lady distinguished in rank and in every other respect, who at that time accidentally happened to be in the colony, had the charity several times to visit the captive. This was an unlooked-for happiness, for the act of kindness thus conferred on me was enhanced by the charms of agreeable conversation, combined with graceful manners and the most captivating modesty. She was a lovely European flower amidst the heath of the Cape. We were also visited in our solitude by numerous officers of all ranks, who expressed sincere sympathy and interest for our misfortune. Had their kindness at that time come to the knowledge of the English ministry, it might have operated to their prejudice. Even now, though, with a great sacrifice to my feelings, I must at all hazards refrain from mentioning their names, but they may be assured that none of their actions or words were lost upon me, for gratitude is a sentiment innate in my heart. Curiosity also had its share in attracting visitors to me. Every stranger who arrived at the colony, and in particular the numerous passengers who were proceeding to India, failed not to visit Newlands. I was a ray escaped from Longwood, and all were eager to see one who had recently been near Napoleon, whom I found to be everywhere the universal object of interest and the constant subject of conversation. I had now an opportunity of answering many questions that were addressed to me respecting the emperor, the theme on which I always dwelt most fondly. How many prejudices did I not destroy? How much astonishment did I not create? It would now be difficult to conceive how many atrocious and absurd reports respecting the emperor had gained credit, owing to the long suspension of intercourse between the two nations and their mutual feelings of irritation. Will it be believed that a military officer of high rank, a man of considerable intelligence, begged that I would tell him candidly whether Napoleon was really capable of writing? He took it for granted that he was a mere soldier and nothing else. He seemed indeed almost to doubt whether he could read. I laughed and asked whether he had ever seen his military proclamations. He replied that he had, but that he supposed these had been made for him. This officer was much astonished and acknowledged he had nothing further to say on the subject when I informed him that, at the age of 27, Napoleon had been a member of the French Institute, undoubtedly the first learned establishment in Europe. As soon as we had fixed our residence in Newlands, my first care was to send to Longwood a few articles of which the emperor stood in need. I knew from experience how many privations he had to endure in that abode of misery, where it was found impossible to procure many things which long habit had rendered necessary or agreeable. With my heart full of these recollections, I resolved to transmit to him whatever I could procure. Though I was well aware that the emperor attached but little importance to luxuries of any kind, I, however, ordered some of the best Constantia and Bordeaux wines, coffee, liquors, oil, eau de cologne. I mentioned that if they were not of the most superior quality, I would decline purchasing them. The keep is yet but ill supplied with the luxuries of Europe, excepting Constantia wine, which is a production of the place. Only small quantities of the articles I had ordered could be procured. I had taken the precaution to ask General Hall whether I should be permitted to send the things, and he very politely replied in the affirmative. With the view of facilitating the reception of this little package at St. Helena, I had determined not to have it brought to me at the Cape. I requested the officers of the governor's staff to have the goodness to make the purchases for me, and only reserved to myself the charge of paying for them. I mentioned these precautions in a letter to Sir Hudson Lowe, to whom I addressed the whole. It is stated by Mr. O'Meara that on the arrival of these things at St. Helena, Sir Hudson Lowe expressed himself much offended at what I had done, which he said was an insult to the English government. And in answer to me, he afterwards stated that, though I had acted with much delicacy, yet it was out of his power to permit the articles to be transmitted to Longwood, because he was charged in the name of the English government to provide everything that was wanted at that establishment. He forgot that he had often assured us the sum allowed him was insufficient for the purpose, and that we on our part had frequently complained to him of wanting necessaries. However, I afterwards understood that the articles had been sent to Longwood, and I had the inexpressible satisfaction of learning that the Constantia wine, in particular, had pleased the emperor. It was reserved for his own use, and he called it by my name in his last moments, when rejecting everything that was offered to him and not knowing what to have recourse to. He said, "Give me a glass of Las Casas' wine." How I was gratified to hear of this. At the same time, I sent back to Sir Hudson Lowe the eventual deed, which, at the sad moment of my departure, had been given to me for the 4,000 louis, which I left for the emperor's use. It stated that the sum was to be immediately repaid to me. On my hesitating to accept it, the governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, ironically said, take it. You will go where the general has funds, and that will enable you to get payment." Afterwards, when I came to recollect this circumstance, not doubting the report that Sir Hudson Lowe would make of it to his ministers, I thought I would send back the deed with the request that he would transmit it to the English government, a correction of the erroneous commentaries with which I was convinced he had not failed to accompany his account of the circumstance. "I reserve to myself," said I, in my letter to him, "merely the signature, which to me is more valuable than the sum itself. The deed is useless," I added. "The emperor's relations would, I am sure, dispute the honor of paying me back the sum, or, in case of emergency, the first Frenchman I may happen to meet will be ready to open a credit account with me." We had now been 2 months at Newlands, and from what I have already stated, many may be led to believe that we were perfectly happy. But can there be happiness in a state of captivity, far from one's native country? We merely whiled away the hours as agreeably as we could. We regulated our time and distributed our occupations. My son pursued his studies. The piano of the Mrs. Somerset was one of his favorite amusements. I read a great deal, for I had books beside me, and my friends regularly furnished me with the journals and new publications. In the evenings, my son walked with me in the beautiful groves surrounding the house, or, as he had bought a horse, he sometimes took an excursion in the neighborhood, and then returned to ride back and forward in the beautiful alleys of Newlands, where I sat down and took pleasure in observing him. I thought I could see his health revive and his strength develop itself. I must confess that in these delicious summer evenings, the pure sky, the fresh air, the beauty of the whole surrounding scene occasionally afforded me a few hours' enjoyment. This was my adieu to life. The rigidity of feeling occasioned by the treatment we had experienced at St. Helena relaxed amidst the charms and perfect tranquility of this delightful place, and I was oftener than once tempted to say, "Why is not the rest of my family here? Alas, if the emperor were but as well situated!" But these moments of oblivion were brief and of rare occurrence, for I repeat, there can be no complete and perfect happiness far from one's country and the objects we love. With whatever charms we may be surrounded, we are ever amidst the desert. The state of feeling and my impatience to arrive at a termination of my distress insensibly had an effect on my health. My constant sleepless nights afforded no respite to my misery. In vain I devoted myself to occupation and exercise during the day, and delayed until late the moment of retiring to rest. No sooner did I lie down, in spite of myself, my thoughts instantly turned on the interval that had gone by. I counted one day less in my exile, and I calculated over and over again the time that must yet elapse ere the order for our deliverance could arrive from London, the accidents that might retard it, These thoughts having once taken possession of my mind, I found it absolutely impossible to close my eyes, and thus I nightly endured the most cruel torments that can be conceived. Meanwhile, the period of the governor's return was at hand, and I began to be perplexed at the ideas of thus finding myself in the same house with him. I presumed it would not be very agreeable to either party to have to confound together under the same roof hospitality and seclusion, but my embarrassment was soon at an end. Whether it was fact or pretense, I know not, but the colonial secretary came to inform me that, in consequence of the expected arrival of Lord Amherst, who was returning to Europe from his embassy to China, the governor found it necessary to assign another residence to me. This colonial secretary, whom I have not yet mentioned, though he was the second civil officer in the colony, was a man perfectly eccentric, both in person and character. He had been several times a member of Parliament. He knew everything, discussed everything, and usually confused everything he meddled with. He was said to be like an encyclopedia, with the sheets bound up in their wrong places. He first took it into his head to fix our abode in a residence which he had caused the government to hire. Fortunately, he relinquished this design because various difficulties opposed its execution. We should have been obliged to proceed thither by sea, and if it had we been safely established in this abode, there would have been some uncertainty respecting the facility of communication with us when necessary. At length, it was determined that we should be lodged with a worthy family who resided about 8 or 10 leagues from the Cape at a place called Tygerberg, which name it received from the Dutch on account of the numerous tigers that inhabited the place at the time when it was first occupied. This occupation is not of very remote date, for these lands have not been exclusively in the possession of the civilized inhabitants until very recently. Several persons informed me that they had themselves seen tigers in the beautiful grounds of Newlands. It would appear that the Dutch, confining themselves to maritime affairs, devoted but little, or at least tardy attention to the progress of colonization. Now, however, the industry and activity of the English are giving a different turn to affairs. All parts of the Cape, and Capetown in particular, which the sailors call the halfway house of the two worlds, will infallibly rise to the highest importance. The soil is rich and the climate admirable. The productions of the temperate zone and those of the tropics may be cultivated almost in all parts at once. English settlers emigrate to the Cape in great numbers, and the population is rapidly increasing. Europe invaded Africa by the south, and the European race will, in course of time, spread over the whole continent as it is now spread over America. From Botany Bay, Europeans will, in course of time, extend to New Holland, and from thence subjugate China. The European race will rule the globe. Happy should it expiate by the blessings of civilization the crimes of conquest or its impurity of origin. From April 6th to August 19th, we left Newlands about the middle of the day and at night reached Tygerberg. Our new host was a Mr. Baker, a native of Koblenz, or its neighborhood, and we looked upon him as one of our countrymen from his origin, his opinions, and his sympathy. The family together formed the most agreeable society imaginable. It would have been impossible for us to have been treated with greater respect and attention. All our wishes were anticipated and gratified. We now commenced the third period of our captivity at the Cape. The first was our insupportable imprisonment in the castle, which fortunately lasted only 10 days. The second was our abode in the charming retreat of Newlands. The third was our residence at the desert of Tygerberg, which was to continue for the space of 4 months. And even this might not be the termination of our captivity at Tygerberg, we found ourselves situated on the confines of the wandering hordes. The country here and there presented detached habitations at considerable distances from each other. These were occupied by cultivators of various nations who were clearing the new grounds in order to turn them to profitable account. And with perseverance, regularity, and a little capital, their efforts will no doubt be successful. Though now removed to the very extremity of the civilized world, we found ourselves treated with even more than kindness. We observed that the people here were neither ignorant nor indifferent with respect to the events of Europe, which, on the contrary, excited an unusual degree of interest. The majority of the population was Dutch and was therefore connected with our national system. Thus, to my surprise, I found the name Napoleon familiar in this desert. The most victorious gamecock in the neighborhood was called Napoleon. The swiftest racehorse was Napoleon. The most invincible bull in the country was Napoleon. I could not refrain from laughing at this, but everyone has his own way of rendering honor and respect, and Napoleon was the noblest of all names in the estimation of the inhabitants of Tigerberg. Notwithstanding our removal from the town, we still continued to receive many visits, and it was very gratifying to us to calculate the degree of interest that was felt for us by the degree of reserve and embarrassment we excited. While we were at Tigersburg, we heard of the wreck of a French ship, the Alouette, which ran aground in the neighborhood of the Cape. I was happy enough to have it in my power to communicate to the crew my sincere sympathy for their misfortune. I never observed so forcibly as here at the extremity of the earth how much fellow countrymen feel themselves to be brothers. In spite of political dissensions, I had already enjoyed the satisfaction of receiving proofs of the same sentiment were entertained with respect to me. Frenchmen secretly visited me, even in this desert. Many had previously gained access to new lands at the hazard of their personal safety and interest for the purpose of offering me their services. Even when I was under close confinement in Capetown, several of my countrymen found means to convey to me expressions of their regard. It is in such situations that testimonies of kindness are most felt and appreciated. The interest we excited was not, however, confined to Frenchmen alone. An American captain came to see me and offered to snatch me from captivity. He informed me that he had adopted every precaution and made every necessary arrangement, and he observed that all depended on my own will, since Mr. Baker was not my jailer, but merely my host. Yet what would have been the use of embracing this proposal? I had but one point, one object in view, and that was to repair to London and appeal to the English ministers. We endeavored to amuse ourselves with our usual occupations. I had procured a person to read to me, and I kept him well employed. In spite of the distance, our friends still continued to supply us with the journals and the new publications. At this time, I read the letters written during the last reign of the emperor by Mr. Hobhouse, who I believe was the first who ventured to speak favorably of Napoleon. I also procured Dr. Warden's work, which, though containing many errors, was, I am confident, written with the very best intentions. And finally, I obtained a sight of the famous manuscript of St. Helena, which excited so much interest and curiosity throughout Europe. Opinion was powerfully divided on the subject of this publication. 1,000 conjectures were afloat respecting its authenticity and real origin. It would certainly be difficult for me to describe the astonishment and doubt which it excited in my mind. What were my feelings and my thoughts when I found pages of truth which seemed to have escaped from my own secret collection, mingled with the whole pages of error and frivolity? I several times stopped, doubting whether I was not dreaming. I recognized not only the substance of certain passages, but even phrases and expressions in the literal form in which I had myself transcribed them from the mouth of the narrator. They were contained in the very papers which Sir Hudson Lowe had detained at St. Helena. I could positively have affirmed that all the grand ideas and noble conceptions formed by Napoleon, all the political speculations, and in short, all the most attractive and interesting contents of the celebrated manuscript were in my journal collected from the Conversation of Napoleon. If only this portion of the publication had been read to me, I should not for a moment have doubted that the work had been obtained directly from Longwood. Even the dates would have warranted this conclusion, for 6 or 7 months had now elapsed since my expulsion from St. Helena. But whence had been procured the alloy with which the better portion of the work was mingled up? This was a riddle which I could not attempt to guess. Can it be, thought I, that the facts contained in this publication have been surreptitiously derived from my papers, certain parts of which may have been selected and put together by strange hands, But besides that, I could not bring myself to cherish such a disagreeable suspicion without better proof. What probability was there that the hostile authority of St. Helena would favor the publication of that which was, upon the whole, favorable to the illustrious victim of the ostracism of kings? What was the real sentiment which dictated the manuscript of St. Helena? This is, in many instances, very equivocal. By what hands was it produced? This question gives rise to many contradictory conjectures. Finally, it may be asked, what was the real object of the publication? It presents various styles, various sentiments, and bears evidence of various degrees of information. This publication must have been the patchwork production of various hands, for how could the individual who appears to have been so familiar with the secret designs of the supposed author and his cabinet have been ignorant of his opinion on various public acts when that opinion was accessible to everybody? As, for example, on the subject of Napoleon's first marriage, the situation of the French in Egypt, the trial of the Duc d'Enghien. It is probable that the man who could have procured by his own means facts of so confidential a nature should have been reduced to the necessity of mingling them up with vulgar errors. And even supposing anyone to have had sufficient shrewdness to have guessed these great truths, would not his judgment have suggested to him the propriety of being correct with respect to the rest? I shall say nothing of the far-fetched and singular phraseology which disfigures the work, and which could only be regarded as a proof of bad taste and an unsuccessful attempt at imitation. Neither shall I comment on the numerous and extraordinary anachronisms which this manuscript contains. These and other circumstances render the publication totally inexplicable. Meanwhile, time was running on, and I saw no probable termination of my exile. The interval necessary for obtaining a return of communication from England had now expired, and still I heard nothing of my removal. I was seized with profound melancholy and almost reduced to despair. I suffered severely from continual and violent pains in my stomach. My restlessness at night still continued. My health daily declined, and disease made rapid inroads in my constitution. I was at this time attacked with pains in the head, which have never since quitted me. At Balcomb's cottage and at Newlands, I had at intervals, after prolonged occupation, experienced a shooting pain in my head like an electrical stroke. This, whenever it occurred, I attributed to fatigue, and if I suspended my occupation, the pain immediately left me. But I now began to be troubled with a continued pain, accompanied, when I happened to be standing, with a slight giddiness, and sometimes attended with a painful sensation about my heart. Hence, I date the commencement and origin of a disease which for the last 5 years has attacked all parts of my head under various symptoms and with various degrees of pain, without leaving me even a single day's respite. For some time I suffered violent and repeated shooting pains above one or the other of my eyes, accompanied by an intolerable ringing in my ears. I was seized with deafness, but after some time, this entirely left me. At another period, all conversation, particularly if I maintained it with any degree of warmth, immediately brought on a swelling about my ears, which impeded the motion of my jaw. I have sometimes felt as though little pimples were suddenly rising under my hair, and this was really the fact, though their existence was but momentary. At other times, all the muscles of my neck became stiff and painful. After my arrival in Germany, this state of health brought on such extreme debility that I found it impossible to apply myself to anything whatever. I could do nothing, not even dictate a few lines, though, fortunately, I could listen to anything that was read to me for several hours in succession without inconvenience. I have in vain had recourse to the faculty. No remedy has afforded me any immediate relief, and hitherto I have found that the most effectual method is to abstain entirely from medicine. After my return to France, I experienced a considerable improvement of my health by dint of repose and retirement. I found myself daily gathering strength, but still, whenever I tried to converse for any length of time, or to bend my thoughts to any particular subject, I immediately experienced a recurrence of my disorder. I felt as though a weight were pressing on the crown of my head. During my convalescence, hearing that complaints had been made respecting the negligent style of the preceding volumes of my journal, I determined to bestow greater attention on editing the succeeding ones. But this application was more than my strength enabled me to bear, and relapsed into a state of illness worse, perhaps, than what I had formerly suffered. Thus, I have been several times forced to suspend these last parts of my journal, and I have even been apprehensive that I should be totally unable to conclude the work. Now, however, I suffer more from debility than pain. The slightest degree of fatigue produces a relapse in my disorder, attended by a sudden weakness over my whole frame. I feel great difficulty in walking, and whenever I stand up, I experience a kind of hesitation and trembling. The ground seems to fail me. I am seized with a staggering, and I am obliged to support myself lest I should fall. Vertigo in the head is a common disorder. Mine, however, may be called vertigo in the feet. But to resume my subject, during the increasing indisposition under which I was laboring at Tigersburg, I wrote to request that the governor would permit me to return to the town for the sake of obtaining medical aid. But this request was vain. Lord Charles Somerset now turned a deaf ear to my representations, and the impatience and irritation excited by their prolongation of my captivity, I several times during my residence at Tigerberg resumed, and perhaps in energetic terms, my appeals to the governor, requesting that he would permit me to return to Europe. I have reason to believe that I succeeded in moving him, whether from feelings of justice on his part or from what other cause I know not, but I am sure he was not without hesitation and anxiety respecting me. He probably asked himself whether it was proper in him to become a jailer after the manner of Sir Hudson Lowe, and whether he had a right, after all, to deprive me of my liberty. But whenever he thus wavered, his ill-natured advisers were at hand to confirm him in his resolution of detaining me. "Is he not well lodged and well fed?" said he. "What then has he to complain of, and how has he acknowledged the good treatment he has experienced? By confining himself and refusing to go abroad in order to give a greater coloring of probability to what he is pleased to call his tyrannical imprisonment. What has been the violent tone of his letters, which have always been out of place? Everything was turned to my prejudice, and one circumstance in particular was taken advantage of for this purpose. On the arrival of Lord Amherst and Admiral Clampin, Lord Charles Somerset, with the intention probably of affording thus strangers an opportunity of seeing and questioning me, sent me in the midst of my desert at Tigerberg a formal invitation to a ball, which, as well as I can recollect, was given in honor of the Prince Regent's birthday. The messenger was directed to wait for my answer. I wrote it on the card of invitation, and in very decided terms. I was vexed that Lord Charles Somerset seemed to have so little idea of the melancholy situation in which I was placed as to imagine me capable of going to a ball. The persons about the governor probably insinuated that, if His Excellency had committed a fault in detaining me, it was now too late to remedy it, that the thing was done, and his lordship would be held responsible for it, that to alter his determination would be acknowledgment that he did not know how to act, would be condemning himself. I presume, therefore, it was resolved to incur the chance of letting the affair come to a close any way it would. All these adverse circumstances combined to estrange Lord Charles Somerset entirely from me, and so far offended him that, in spite of his natural disposition, he treated me with a degree of inhumanity. I addressed a letter to him describing the state of my health and urging the indispensable necessity of my removal to the town. But to this he coolly replied in a note sent by his aide-de-camp that, though he could not alter his arrangements, he had given orders for my obtaining medical attendance. But I was situated at a distance of 8 or 10 leagues from Capetown. The doctor could only visit me once a week, and as he prescribed remedies which could only be procured in the town, their application was impracticable. I lost all patience on reading this answer, which seemed to be an act of cruel irony rather than a measure of relief, and I indignantly addressed a letter directly to the colonial secretary. I stated that, as it was by his direction I had been removed to Mr. Baker's. I took the liberty of informing him that as it was absolutely necessary I should be near my medical attendant, I presumed he could have no objection to my removal to the town, to the house of Dr. Lessing, Mr. Baker's father-in-law. He replied that he had consulted with the governor, and that his excellency had declared that his instructions did not admit of my coming back to Capetown. But I determined not to be satisfied with this, and I again wrote to the colonial secretary. I informed him that, in spite of his letter, nothing but absolute force should prevent me from quitting Tygerberg. I was determined to repair to the town, and that the governor might, if he pleased, confine me there, and even keep me as a closer prisoner than I was at Tygerberg, as at least I should enjoy the advantage of being within reach of medical advice and remedies, that though perhaps I had no reason to attach great value to existence, yet I felt it to be a kind of duty to defend my life. Fortunately, the permission for my departure at length arrived from England, just at the very moment when I was about to execute my determination. Otherwise, I know not how the matter would have ended. The governor communicated this welcome intelligence to me, accompanied by the offer of a lodging prepared for me in the town. But I declined accepting it, and proceeded, as I had originally intended, to the house of Dr. Lessing, where I experienced all the attention and hospitality of Tygerberg, in a truly patriarchal family whose society produced a beneficial effect on my health and spirits. Now commenced a new series of vexations. I was doomed to drain the cup of disappointment to the very dregs. The governor, when he informed me of my release, mentioned the two opportunities presented themselves for my departure, and he wished me to make a choice of one. I immediately replied that the speediest would be the most desirable. I now confidently expected the receipt of my passports and the final commands of the governor. I was confined in my bed. 2 days elapsed, and in the meantime one of the ships sailed. What was my vexation and disappointment, particularly when I was afterwards informed that the governor had nothing more to communicate to me, and that I was at liberty to make whatever arrangements I pleased respecting my departure. I vehemently complained that the first opportunity should have been allowed to escape, but for this there was no remedy. A large transport ship was lying in the harbor, which was destined to convey a regiment of artillery to England. I begged the governor would permit me to take my passage in this vessel, as there were medical officers on board. His answer was that there was no accommodation for me. In vain I represented that if there had been 2 additional artillery officers, they would certainly not be left behind, that if there were 2 more sailors to be embarked, they would surely find room for them, and we wanted no better accommodation. All these arguments were unavailing. I was informed the ship was to touch at St. Helena, and that this circumstance in itself would preclude the possibility of my taking passage on board of her. I was compelled to yield, and confine myself to the choice which the governor had so generously left me, which was to proceed to Europe by the only ship that was then in the harbor. This was an extremely small brig, an absolute cockboat, destined to perform a voyage of 3,000 leagues. However, I felt no hesitation. I would have jumped into the sea rather than have delayed another moment. The bargain was soon struck, and I was now all impatience for the moment of departure.